and specifically today the Class 2 amalgam prep, specifically for upper premolars. And here's two different situations that we may encounter as we are working on typodonts or patients. Oops, I'm going to give that a little bit more. Just didn't quite get the gingival embrasure the way I wanted it. Okay, we'll settle for that. Okay, so we have a different situation between this tooth here and this tooth over here, or I should say the teeth, because it's not just the occlusal outline. The occlusal outline is pretty similar between the two, but the proximal contact is what's different. This is a little bit more similar to the Columbia typodont. This is more like the Kilgore over here. So you see the difference. The size of the contact facial-lingually, the size of the contact occlusal gingivally, the location of the contact relative to the central groove, size of the gingival embrasure, size of the lingual embrasure, all those things are different. What is the same is that each one has decay, and that decay is in a particular orientation, a particular location relative to the contact. Okay? Now, of course, we assume for what we're doing now, since we're doing conventional Class 2 designs, is that we have decay in the pits and fissures. This decay in the pits and fissures, we're going to assume comes up to the DEJ, comes down the pit into the DEJ, and we'll have more to say about that a little bit later. And then, of course, we have proximal decay probably coming out, extending about like that, and involving the gingival border of the contact and down into the gingival embrasure. Okay? Over here, same thing for the occlusal decay. Proximal decay, again, associated with the location of the contact. So the decay tends to be into the gingival border of the contact and involve the gingival embrasure, extending to the DEJ. But the location facial-lingually and occlusally has to do with the shape and position of the contact. So as we develop the design of the prep here, we're going to design the prep in each of these situations to remove the decay, obviously. And so the prep's going to look different in each of these two situations, but it's going to accomplish the same thing. It's going to remove the decay. We'll have two ideal preps that are ideal in terms of clearances and angles and so forth, but they will look different because the box area for this one and the box area for this one are going to be very different, and the relationship between those boxes and the isthmus that removes the central groove is going to be quite a bit different. Okay? So we'll develop it one step at a time here. So let's just talk about the isthmus. So we're going to remove the decay in the central groove. So we're going to cut an isthmus through there. So that's pretty similar in both of those cases, and we'll talk later about how to do this. But for right now, we just know that we have a central groove, and we need to remove that central groove because it's got decay. We want to keep the width. The width of the isthmus should be at least 1 millimeter, so we can condense amalgam in that area, because this is specifically for amalgam today. And as we go closer to the mesial pit, excuse me, as I go closer to the mesial pit, we're going to make a wall that's beyond the pit enough so that we can remove the decay, but that doesn't compromise or threaten the enamel of the marginal ridge. That's one of the key things. So we're going to put our wall at the marginal ridge about in this location. We'll talk about where we go pulpally later. We're going to put the marginal ridge wall beyond the pit and about a third of the distance between the pit and the top of the marginal ridge. So that's a position that will typically guarantee that we're going to remove the decay that's extending down from the pit. But we're also going to lean the wall toward the marginal ridge, so that we'll have a divergent wall in that area. Again, we're trying to preserve, protect the enamel at the marginal ridge. So we're going to have enamel rods that are going like this, and we want to make sure that we don't compromise these enamel rods by cutting the wrong angle. For example, if instead of leading the wall toward the marginal ridge, if we undercut the marginal ridge like this, all these enamel rods are now undermined, and that will just fracture and break in the patient's mouth, shortening the lifetime of the restoration considerably. So again, when we're doing good dentistry, we're looking for doing a restoration that's going to last its expected lifetime. If you undercut this wall like that, it's not going to happen. So that's going to be a serious error. Also, we're extending out facially, in this case the mesial buccal, to a certain extent. And typically, because there's 3 developmental lobes on the facial, and we might have fissures between each pair of those, it's not unusual to find a groove coming out here that has some decalcification in it because it's a fissured groove. And so we extend into that groove to remove the decay, and we get this little shape right here. Now there's a typical name for that shape, dovetail. But any of you ever seen a dove? Their tails don't look like this at all, okay? It looks more like a shark tail, doesn't it? Or a foot. There's a heel, there's a toe, and so forth. So the name, not worrying about the name so much. The dovetail name really refers more to when you're doing a wood drawer and you're connecting pieces of wood together in a well-made drawer. They're put together like this so that they can't come apart. They're mechanically interlocked. So that's what we're doing here, is we're mechanically interlocking the amalgam so it can't slide out distally because it's wider facial angle here than it is in the isthmus. So it keeps it from sliding out distally. So the dovetail is 2 things. It's a retentive feature in terms of keeping the amalgam from sliding out distally, but also it is removing the decay coming out to the mesial buccal area. So it has 2 roles, 2 functions, and that's what we need to kind of keep in mind here. Okay, and again, when we're doing that, we have to make sure we get the wall in the right place, leaning the right way, so that we don't compromise the marginal ridge. We're very careful about that. Probably for every 10 class 2s I see, 1 of them will have a nice angulation toward the marginal ridge, and 9 will be undercut like this. Okay? So again, if you're not paying attention to it, you're going to fail because of that. That's all it takes to fail, right there. So if I'm looking down the axis, I want to see that wall. So we use the mirror, look down the axis. If I can't see the wall at the marginal ridge, then probably it's undercut. If it's undercut, we got a big problem. Okay, so that's the occlusal outline. We'll talk later about, we want the prep to be centered on the central groove, facial-lingually. We want to make sure we don't have the bird leaning one way or the other. We'll talk about how to do it so that we make sure we do it correctly while we're doing it. We need to see what it is that we're doing, and you need to see that we're doing it correctly while we're doing it. But again, we'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, let's go over here and look at the proximal contact area, because we have decay there. We need to eliminate that. Mm-hmm.
So the outline should be like perpendicular to the like a pulp chamber.
By outline, you mean the facial lingual walls?
No, the other line that you drew there.
This right here?
Yeah.
Okay. It's going to be, of course, it's an obtuse angle here, and again, it's leaning a little bit toward the marginal ridge. It's going to go fairly much parallel to the marginal ridge. We want to keep the distance between that wall and the marginal ridge fairly uniform, so we don't let it get too thin at any one point. but I wasn't 100% clear about what you meant by perpendicular.
No, I was talking about the like low drawing, the low one.
Right here?
Yeah.
Okay.
You said it should be like perpendicular. I was asking if we go the way that you said we shouldn't go. That helps the amalgam to be in the like preparation, doesn't it?
Oh, okay, you're saying retention.
Yeah.
Okay, and that's a good point. The facial lingual walls are going to be slightly convergent occlusally. I haven't drawn that view. If I were looking down this direction, I could see that those facial lingual walls will be slightly convergent occlusally. That keeps the amalgam from coming out vertically. So it can't come out that way. So even though we have this wall divergent, it doesn't allow the amalgam to come out vertically because of the facial lingual undercuts. Okay, thanks for bringing that up. Facial lingually, we're going to have a little bit of occlusal convergence on both the box walls and on the isthmus. Not much, just a little bit, a degree or two. That's all we really need to have. As long as we have some convergence, the amalgam is so rigid, it's not going to come out at all. Okay, and we'll see that develop as we work in the box area too. Okay, so now, when we're finding the occlusal outline in the box area, we want to make sure we find a margin, both in the facial lingual, where we have gone beyond the decay. Okay, and the decay extends out into the embrasures typically, so the margin is probably going to be beyond the contact area. And in fact, if we get a clearance of 0.5 millimeters between the margin and the adjacent tooth, then that usually means that we're out far enough facially and lingually to be beyond the decay or the decalcification at the surface, typically. So we'll plan to get at least 0.4 to 0.5 millimeters clearance facially and lingually with our margins. Same thing over here. Okay, so if our box is going to be that wide facial lingually, it has to be for this prep, and it's certainly a lot smaller over there for the other one. Again, just depending on the size of the contact and the size of the decay area, which is related to the size of the contact. Now, of course, when we make a box and we go gingerly, we have to have an outline form that includes a facial wall and a lingual wall. So we're going to extend in from these margins. From now, we're going to extend in at a 90-degree angle that is perpendicular to the tangent to the surface at the margin. Because that, after all, is the direction of the enamel rods. The enamel rods are always perpendicular to the surface. Wherever we are, the enamel rods are perpendicular to the surface. So they're going to come down here. So now our wall is perpendicular to the surface, which means it's parallel to the enamel rods. So we're not undermining any of the enamel rods. Same thing over here. But what if we get the angle wrong? What if we do an angle like this? Well, now we have some enamel rods in here that are no longer, sorry about that, let me try this again. Let me start out with the acute one. Here we have the angle coming in, and now these enamel rods in this area are no longer supported by dentin. So the dent support for these is cut away, so all this is undermined enamel in this whole area here. And that's a problem. Okay, so the enamel breaks away, and now we have an open margin, we have recurrent decay. So that's an acute exit angle, and we're going to try desperately to avoid that. If we were to make an acute exit angle, what would we have to do to fix it?
We have to increase the lingual clearance.
Yeah, we'd have to move the margin out here and then recut an angle 90 degrees in this way to get rid of all this undermined enamel. Okay, so that's going to make it so that we're extending farther lingually than we really need to there. Now, let me just put it this way for future reference. If you get an acute angle and get undermined enamel, you have no choice. You must fix that. Okay? The only way to fix it is to overextend the margin. Well, the overextension may not be a failure. The undermined enamel is a failure. So it's possible that we can exchange a failing error for a non-failing error. Overextension is an error. It might not fail the prep. An acute exit angle has undermined enamel. That's going to fail the prep. Okay, so those are the things, if you understand what's going on, if you understand what really fails the prep and what doesn't, then you can make some choices that may make it so that you survive and you have a passing prep that isn't ideal, but it's still passing. Okay, and then when we have an obtuse exit angle, like this, now the enamel rods are all supported just fine, but the amalgam that's at that area has a thin angle. If the amalgam angle is thin, then it's fragile and it can break, and then it opens up the margin, and then we have recurrent decay. So we want to get the amalgam as close to 90 degrees as we can. We want to make sure, get the exit angle here as close to 90 degrees as we can. That means we do not make it at all acute. But obtuse, we can have a little bit of an obtuse angle, but not much. You know, a little bit obtuse is still okay, but when we get too obtuse for amalgam, we have a problem. So basically, we're going to try to get as close to 90 degrees as we can, but not acute at all. If it's a little bit obtuse, we can survive. If it's a little bit acute, we're dead. Okay? All right. By the way, I didn't say this, but anytime you want, you can take out your camera, your phone, take pictures of the board. You can videotape me while I'm talking. Whatever you want to do is fine. Whatever I'm presenting is yours. You can, take pictures of it, preserve it. Watch the video again when you're doing it on your mannequin and so forth. So feel free to do that. All right, so we don't want an acute angle. We don't want an obtuse angle. We want a 90-degree angle, so make sure you know how to recognize that. And again, the amalgam, we want to have a bulk of 90 degrees at the margin as much as we can, but we have to be paying very careful attention to the strength of the enamel. Again, unsupported enamel doesn't really work out very well. Okay, same thing over here, 90-degree exit angle coming in. Again, it's tangent to the surface. It's perpendicular to the tangent to the surface at the margin. Same thing over here. So we plan to make, we'll talk about how to do it later, but we're going to plan to make walls that come in straight, perpendicular to the surface. We're going to take those walls in far enough so they go beyond where ultimately we're going to put the axis wall. So find the clearance, get the angle, get the length, and then once you get beyond where you want to put the axis wall, we're going to make a smooth connection to the isthmus. Like that. Over here, same thing. Smooth connection to the isthmus. So in this one, it's kind of interesting because we have a curve sort of going back lingually here. Whereas normally we think of these curves as going this way. We don't also think in terms of the textbook pictures, we don't think about two of these curves. There's a name for those curves, right?
Reversive.
Reverse curves, S curves, whatever. It's a real problem to give them a name, all right? Because, for example, if this contact was shifted over here, this box would be shifted over here. And if the facial wall of the box were right here, it lines up with the isthmus, so obviously there's not going to be a reverse curve, will there? So all we're doing is making sure that wherever the facial wall is, wherever the isthmus is, we make a smooth connection between them. that might not involve any curvature at all, but sometimes people think, okay, the name reverse curve means there must be a curve. And they don't know why there should be a curve. They don't understand the basics here. And so they end up cutting a curve that ruins the whole breadth. So just make sure you have the isthmus doing what it should be doing, the facial wall doing what it should be doing, and then make a smooth connection between them. Same thing on the lingual side. And you get the outline form that's as ideal as possible. So this is an ideal class 2 occlusal outline form. This is an ideal class 2 occlusal outline form. Clearly they're very different from each other. Neither one of these you're going to see in a textbook. But these are the kinds of things we see in patients all the time. So again, it's basically making sure you do an isthmus that takes care of the decay in the central groove. Make a dovetail, it takes care of the decay in the other pit, protects the marginal ridge. Find clearances so that you're going to be getting rid of the decay that's in the proximal embrasures. Make an exit angle that doesn't undermine any enamel and keeps the amalgam strong enough. Come in far enough so that you're beyond where you're going to put the axial and make a smooth curve so we have a nice flowing outline. And we got it. Okay? So at this point, we're all the way over here. And now we're going to plan to go gingially because we have to get rid of the decay. Over here we're going to go gingially pretty far to get rid of the decay. Over here, not so far. So this clearly taller than this here. This wall here, the height of this wall here, is clearly taller than we have over here. If I were to go gingially a little bit farther, maybe get a little bit more clearance gingially, that would be closer to 0.5 millimeter. Then it's even, the difference between them is even more obvious. So if we get a 0.5 millimeter clearance gingially, then probably we will have gotten rid of the decay. So that's what we try to do. I might even redraw the decay so it comes down here a little bit farther gingially. Okay, in any event, we're going to be looking for something like a 0.5 millimeter clearance gingially, and we don't care how tall the wall is. The height of this wall means nothing. Because if we put the pulpal floor in the right place and put the gingival floor in the right place, the height of the wall is whatever it is. That's it. We'll talk about exactly where the pulpal floor goes, but you can see it should be just indented. When we look down here, we'll see the DEJ on the facial lingual walls of the isthmus, just like this. So we get the pulpal floor just indented, so we can evaluate that we've gotten rid of the decay. There's no decay migrating along the DEJ, so we're okay there. But we'll talk about exactly how to know where we are pulpally on a typodont where there is no DEJ. But in a minute. But what I really want to impress upon you is the fact that if we put the pulpal floor in the right position and put the gingival floor in the right position, the height that's in between them depends on the size and position of the contact area. And it's going to be very different from tooth to tooth. It's going to be very much shorter for a Kilgore typodont, very much taller for a Columbia and an accidental typodont. So those are two completely different situations. Now, sometimes people get confused and they think, okay, I need to get a wall height of a certain height, and then of course that causes all kinds of trouble because you can't set a particular depth and a particular gingival position and a particular height at the same time. Okay, once you set this and set this, this is a consequence of those other two. Okay, the height of the wall is a consequence of the pulpal floor position and the gingival floor position. So you can't arbitrarily adjust that height as long as you're happy with the pulpal floor and the gingival floor, another way of saying it. So don't worry about that height. All right, so anyway, as we go gingially, we're going to make an axial wall It has this kind of shape. If I'm looking from the occlusal, I'll see some gingival clearance. Now, the shape of the axial is kind of important. We don't want to go too deep axially at any one point. So we try to keep the shape following the outside surface of the tooth pretty accurately. We'll talk about how to do that. In fact, the person that figured out how to get the shape of the axial correct was a Greek guy back about 3,000 years ago. Imagine how a Greek guy did class 2 amalgam preps 3,000 years ago. His name was Euclid. Remember Euclid? Anybody know who Euclid was? Is that familiar? Okay, he invented geometry. At least in the Western culture, he's said to develop geometry. In other cultures, probably there's somebody else that developed it. They didn't have email back then, so they couldn't communicate that well. But he said the following. He said that if you have two lines that are each perpendicular to a third line, the first two lines are parallel to each other. Does that sound familiar? Okay. In Western culture, that's Euclid. From where you guys come from, that could have been somebody else, but it's still a universal truth. It's like pi. It's true everywhere. Okay. Two lines, each perpendicular to a third, are parallel to each other. The facial wall here is perpendicular to the outside surface of the tooth. It's also perpendicular to the axial wall. Therefore, the axial wall follows the curvature of the tooth. Isn't that cool? So all we have to do is make a 90-degree exit angle and a 90-degree internal angle, and the axial wall automatically follows the shape that it should. That's all we have to do. 90-degree exit angle, 90-degree internal angle. Same thing over here. Exit angle, internal, everything 90 degrees, and the axial wall is parallel to the outside surface, again because of geometry. So when we're doing these preps, and we'll talk about how to do this prep again in a few minutes, we want to make sure we get square corners, 90-degree corners, 90-degree line angles internally. So I'll make nice square corners, and the axial wall just automatically follows what it should. Of course, we have to make sure we get something close to 90 degrees. We have to make sure that this wall is pretty long, so we go beyond the axial wall or beyond where the axial wall is going to be before we make any curvature. And then it's much easier to find square corners and cut away from those walls and create the shape of the axial wall that we want. Okay, so again, we'll talk about that in much more detail later, and I'll talk about what burr we're going to use and the whole bit. All right, so we got some gingival clearance. I can see it. I can look down this way. I can see the gingival clearance. So at this point, we're okay. We're going to bevel the axial pulpal line angle because we want to not create any stresses within the amalgam. So we know about that. Okay, so let's talk about the pulpal floor. I said we'd talk about where it is, and if we're talking about a prep on a typodont tooth where we don't have a DEJ to look at, somehow we have to measure the position of the pulpal floor. We have to measure something that relates to the position of the pulpal floor. And this is where everybody gets kind of confused. And the entity that confuses more people than any other is the dental schools. Hate to say it, but you'll often see a dental school sending a list of criteria for you to use when you're doing the preps. And they may very well say pulpal depth equals 1.5. And if I asked you, how deep should the pulpal floor be, you might very well answer 1.5. It's a very common answer. So when I say pulpal depth equals 1.5, that's something that you can read, that somebody sends you from a dental school. What does that mean? It's supposed to tell you something about where the pulpal floor is. What does that tell you? You're right. Nothing. I'm getting no answer because it doesn't tell you anything. The term pulpal depth, and I'm going to tell you right now, really watch out for this word, depth. Very, very dangerous word. But the term pulpal depth, all it says is we're going to talk about where the pulpal floor should be. And the 1.5 says something is 1.5. But it doesn't tell you what is 1.5. What are we measuring? We're measuring something that should be 1.5. It has something to do with the position of the pulpal floor, but I'm not going to tell you what to measure. Okay? That makes no sense at all. If a guy walked in the room and I told you that guy's 36 inches, does that tell you anything? Same thing here. We don't know what we're measuring. It doesn't help to have a number if you don't know what that number is supposed to relate to. So, what do you think? What could I measure that relates to the position of the pulpal floor? You have to measure something, right? What are the options? What are the choices? So this prep, if I draw it on the surface, comes out like this, maybe like that. So here's the prep, here's the outline. So if I'm going to measure something that's related to the pulpal floor, wouldn't I be measuring maybe the height of the wall from the occlusal cava surface margin to the pulpal floor? This outline form has walls all the way around it, right? So I can measure those wall heights. Does that make sense? Okay. Here's a margin of the prep on the occlusal surface, right there. Here's the pulpal floor. I can measure the height of that wall in between the two. So if you think that's a good idea, then my next question to you would be, well, where are you going to measure the height of that wall? Here's the occlusal outline. The occlusal cava surface margin is all the way around here. And between that margin and the pulpal floor, the height of the wall changes from point to point. Where the triangular ridge is here, that wall height is going to be much taller than the height over here. Because this margin that's closest to the marginal ridge is also closest to the mesial pit. The pit is where the lowest part of the occlusal surface is, right? So when you have a margin closest to the pit, it's going to be lower, and then the height of the wall between that margin and the pulpal floor is going to be less. So the shortest wall tends to be near the pits, and we want that to be 1.5. Basically, we want the shortest wall to be 1.5, because that guarantees that the amalgam at the margin will be no less than 1.5 millimeters thick. Okay? If the amalgam is 1 millimeter thick at a margin, it's going to fail. If it's half a millimeter thick at the margin, it's going to fail. So I want to make sure that the shortest wall is 1.5 so that the minimum amount of amalgam bulk at those margins is going to be 1.5. That make sense? Okay. So if you say pulpal depth is 1.5, you're not saying anything about what you're measuring. You're not saying anything about the height of the wall somewhere. You're not saying anything about where you're going to measure the height of that wall. You're just saying something's 1.5. Well, I don't know. It's your shoe size. I don't know. Doesn't make any difference. Okay? Now, the next issue is that if we're measuring the height of the wall at the marginal ridge, which is the shortest because it's closest to the pit, what if the wall is in the wrong position? What if I put the wall at the pit and then we made it 1.5 millimeters tall? Okay, then it would be too deep. If I put the wall at the top of the marginal ridge and made it 1.5 millimeters tall, it's too shallow. So the wall has to be in the right location, 1/3 of the distance between the pit and the top of the marginal ridge, leaning a little bit toward the marginal ridge, and 1.5 millimeters tall, then we're good. Okay? If you don't get it in the right place, and then you make it 1.5 millimeters tall, you might be totally messed up. So you got to make sure you see where you put the margin, you see the angulation of the wall, you see the height of the wall at that point where it's shortest, then we're okay. And these other walls in other places are going to be much taller. We don't care about that. Some places I see say pupil depth equals 1.5 to 2.5. And maybe 3. I don't care. All that means is if they said the height of the wall around the occlusal outline from the occlusal cable surface margin to the pupil floor should be at the shortest 1.5, in other areas it could be a lot taller, then it's clear. But they don't make it clear. So most people say, okay, if they read this, pupil depth equals 1.5 to 2.5, they say, oh boy, I don't have to be very careful about where I put my pupil floor, do I? It could be 1.5, it could be 2.5. I have 1 millimeter, so even if I'm 1 millimeter too deep, they think it's okay. No, that's not it at all. Totally the wrong interpretation. We see how people get confused? It's really easy to get confused if the people that are writing the criteria aren't clear. This is not clear at all. It's almost deliberately obtuse, not in terms of the angle. Okay, so I'm going to tell you what University of Colorado says in their list of criteria. I'm going to write something down. They give you this list of 20 things. I'm going to write something down that's directly from their list, and you're going to tell me what it means. Depth of the axial wall equals 1.5. What do you think that means? Again, you're right. Doesn't mean anything. But what do you think most people think it means? Depth of the axial wall. What is that?
The gingival seat should be 1.5.
What about the gingival seat?
The depth of the gingival seat should be 1.5.
Watch that word depth. Something about the gingival seat. I'm not clear yet. So I mean this floor down here, this area right here, gingival floor, gingival seat. What about it?
The width of the gingival seat mesiodistally should be 1.5.
That's 100% clear. Now I know exactly what you mean. Okay? So the mesial distal width of the gingival floor should be some number, and it should also be uniform from facial to lingual. It will be if we have the right shape, because we have the right the internal angles. So that's exactly what we want, and that's probably what they mean. But that's not what they say. They say the depth of the axial wall. Most people think that means the depth gingivally. Most people think that's asking for a certain height. And that's the problem. It's misleading. If you're not clear, then you leave room for misinterpretation. People misinterpret that all the time. So they end up making the wall height 1.5, and that may or may not be at all appropriate. What's interesting is that if you think it means the height of the wall here, then in that list of 20 things, there should be something that talks about this position, the position of the axial wall axially, right? So the width of the genital floor relates to the position of the axial wall axially. But if you think that means the genital position, the genital height of this axial wall, then somewhere else in that list, there needs to be something talking about the axial position. It's not there. There's nothing else that talks about the axial wall. Therefore, since this is critically important, the position of the axial wall axially, critically important. If you think that means the height, then there's nothing that talks about the axial depth. That's so important, it has to be there. Well, then that's it, as you surmised. But see how complicated this gets when people don't write things down clearly, they don't explain things well? So let's say that you are at a dental school and you're about to take an exam, and the guy gets up in front, or the woman gets up in front, and they're orienting you toward the exam, and they say, we want you to make the height of the axial wall, just to make it clear, I mean the distance between the pulpal floor and the genital floor, we want you to make that 1.5. Totally clear, unambiguous, there's no room for misinterpretation. You know exactly what they're asking for. We want you to make this height 1.5. What would you do? You're in a bunch of candidates for an exam. Somebody gets up front and says that. What would you do? In the moment, right there. They say it, you're going to do something. What are you going to do? I told you to do it earlier. Right? Your hand's going to go right up. And what are you going to ask? Again, this is geometry. What are you going to ask? You know a little bit about grading right now. We've been talking about it. They're going to grade based on the genital clearance. They're going to grade based on the pulpal floor position, the height of the shortest wall. Now they're telling you that they want you to make the height of the axial a certain height. Does that make sense? As we said before, the height is a function of these other two things. So if this is right and this is right, the height is right. But they want you to make it different, potentially. So you have to ask a question. What's the question going to be? Okay, if I put the pulpal floor in the right place and I make the axial wall 1.5 millimeters tall, how much clearance will I get? I don't know. Depends on the shape of the contact. I don't know how much genital clearance I'm going to get. If I'm restricted to make it 1.5, or if I have to go down gingerly until I get 1.5, my genital clearance could be nothing or it could be too much. So the question is, are you going to grade genital clearance? And they better answer no. Okay? Because I can't. I can't grade two things at the same time like this. Now, why would they say that? Can you imagine a scenario where they might ask you to make that a certain height? It makes no sense, but maybe for them it does, because for Kilgore type endodonts, especially the upper molar MO mesial contact, the mesial contact is so thin and incisal gingival that once you've gone pulpally, the axial wall height is going to be really short. The amount that you have to go gingival to get genital clearance is maybe just 0.5 millimeter at the most. But what if you go a little bit too deep pulpally? Then you have no axial wall. So that's the problem. Schools that use Kilgore, if they're going to ask a prep on that tooth, they may very well say that they want you to make an axial wall of 1.5 millimeters because they just want an axial wall. If they make a mistake on the pulpal floor and go a little bit too deep, there's no axial wall. They really want to grade the axial wall. They really want to know that you can put the axial wall in just the right place because it's so critical. If you go too deep, you're in the pulp chamber. They want to make sure that you can put the axial wall exactly where it should be. If you go a little bit too deep pulpally, they don't have anything to grade. So they just tell you, make an axial wall so we can grade where it is. And no, we don't care about how much gingival clearance there is. So if you know all this, if everything here makes sense geometrically, then when they say something like that, your hand shoots up and you go, are you going to grade gingival clearance? And they'll have to say, no, we don't grade that. We're only asking you to make a wall so that we know that we can see where the position is axially. We said it's so important. Okay? So does this seem kind of subtle? Seem a little bit more analytical than what you're used to? So this is the level at which you need to be evaluating class 2 preps that determines the lifetime of the restoration. This is the level where you have to evaluate the prep. Okay? So we're going to be pretty careful about this. And of course, this is the level at which you're going to be graded when you take an exam. And again, you need to be able to grade your prep better than they do. So you have to have a pretty good sense of the geometry of the situation. Okay? All right, it does get kind of interesting though, doesn't it? If this doesn't turn you on, if this doesn't excite you with all of the little details here, then, find some way to get excited. It's interesting. So I'm going to ask you a question, and then we'll find out just how interesting you think it is, okay? Go ahead.
So when we want to start with the occlusal surface, in what depth we're going to start?
Let's talk about that in a few minutes, because I haven't talked about doing the prep yet. I've talked about how it should be done and how to evaluate it, but I haven't yet told you about how to do it. So I'll go over that in detail. But it's a very fair question at this point. I'm just going to delay the answer a few minutes. So let me ask you a question. So that Kilgore prep right there, the upper premolar, in order to evaluate the position of the pulpal floor, I have to measure the height of the shortest wall around the occlusal outline. Where's the shortest wall?
We have the mesial margin.
Well, in general, where do we find the shortest wall? Where do you expect to find the shortest wall? Near a pit, because that's the lowest part of the occlusal, so the wall gets shorter. So where do you think the shortest wall is on that prep there? This wall is pretty close to the distal pit, so this one might be short. We know this one's going to be, we want this one to be 1.5, but let's check this one too, because that could be less. Again, depending upon where the box is relative to the occlusal anatomy, you might have to curve back a lot to keep the margin away from that pit so it doesn't get too short. So we need to check the height of that wall right there. So what if I check it? First of all, I know to check it. And I do check it, and I check it well, so I actually measure accurately the height of that wall and find it's only 0.5. What are you going to do? You could say make it taller, but how do we make it taller? We have some choices. And the choices are based on why it's short. So what are the possible explanations for why that wall got so short? The pulpal floor in the mesial pit area is fine. The margin's in the right place, the height of the wall is 1.5, so we know the pulpal floor position in that area is just fine. But we've got a short wall over on the distal side. What could be the cause of that?
Because there's a triangular ridge, but the cuspal ridge would that affect the height wall?
Make it shorter? Yeah, the triangular ridge, when they come down, they make walls tall. Because the triangular ridges are nice and high, but getting close to that pit makes it shorter. Of course, we're close to that distal pit there. Okay, what if we had the wrong exit angle here? What if we made an obtuse angle and that margin got too close to the pit? Then the wall gets short. How else? What else could make it short? We know the pulpal floor position here is good. What if the pulpal floor is not horizontal? What if it's like this? Ah, okay. It could be sloping up this way, so it's appropriate depth here, but it rises toward the distal. And now this wall is going to get short. Maybe it's leaning this way, but it could be leaning this way. So if the pulpal floor is rising toward the lingual or rising toward the distal, or the outline form is underextended, all those things make that wall short. It could be all three of those things. But if it's only one of those things, figure out what it is before you fix it. Okay? If the outline form is underextended like this, so their margin is too close to the pit, and then you make the pulpal floor deeper, well, maybe that's not necessary. Just change the outline form until it's 90 degrees and stay away from that pit a little bit more. Now the wall is taller and you're good. And maybe you don't have to change the pulpal floor at all. But the point is that, you know, when you know there's a problem, figure out what caused the problem before you try to fix it. Okay? And that's generally true. You need to be paying attention to that on whatever situation you run into. In fact, in real life, it's important. When you know there's a problem, figure out the cause before you try to fix it. Okay? All right, so let's say we've got over here, this prep's got a pretty big box to it, doesn't it? Facial-lingually, it's a pretty big box, larger than the other one. Pretty big box, so that means that the marginal ridge of the restoration is going to be pretty big and it's going to have a lot of impact. And so there's going to be a lot of force tending to push the amalgam out of the box distally. So what prevents the amalgam from going out of the box distally? Hmm?
Answer is bad.
Now, I mean in the patient's mouth when they're chewing and so forth, after they get home. So the amalgam's filling this prep, and the box is pretty big. There's a big marginal ridge, and we're chewing on it. There's a lot of load on that marginal ridge. So it's trying to push the amalgam out distally. What keeps it from coming out?
The convergence.
The dovetail. Okay? At this point, that's the only thing keeping it from going out this way. It locks it in mechanically. But here's the problem. There's a lot of force over here, and the retentive feature is way over here. In between them is a narrow isthmus, and right in this area, the load will be concentrated, and the amalgam probably will crack right there. Okay? That's going to be a problem. So how do we avoid that? If you have a big box and a small isthmus, how do we avoid the amalgam cracking there? How do we get additional retention other than the dovetail?
Wow.
It put secondary groove.
Yeah, we're going to put retentive grooves in the facial lingual walls. Okay, so that's between the axial wall and the DEJ, we're going to put a groove. Like that. So now when the amalgam goes into those grooves, it won't let the amalgam come out this way because of those walls just prevent that from happening. So again, we're talking about mechanical retention for amalgam. So if you have retentive grooves in the box, It keeps the amalgam from breaking here, which it would otherwise do. Okay, one more thing. Right now, I've drawn the gingival floor as horizontal, but in that area, presuming we're in enamel, the enamel rods are going like this. So the enamel rods are undermined by the gingival floor. So we're going to angle the gingival floor to remove the undermined enamel. So we're going to angle the floor gingivally. Okay, so those are the basics. And the different teeth, the different anatomy of teeth that we're dealing with, and different quadrants, different arches and so forth. That's just the anatomical part, that's just the occlusal part. And so the key issues are represented by this tooth right here. Especially when it comes to working in the proximal contact and going gingivally, getting the box form, getting rid of the decay and so forth. So all those things are going to be pretty universal no matter what tooth we're working on. Some occlusal anatomies are a little different from others. And so the Udemy course, I'll talk more about that. But we'll also be talking about that as we go through the next, especially tomorrow. We'll be working in all 4 quadrants tomorrow. So we'll see more about more complicated occlusal anatomies, but that's all simple compared to what we've talked about today. Okay, so any questions about where we've gone so far right here? Everything clear? Semi-lost? We'll see. All right, so what we haven't talked about yet is how to do it. Since we're talking about how to do it, anything that isn't clear will probably become a little more clear. As I demonstrate it, it'll become a little bit more clear, and as you work on it, and I help you work on it, then it'll become even more clear. All right? So, ready to actually do the prep? All right, so the first thing we do, of course, is choose a bird. So a very common bird to use for the class 2s, for the occlusal, is a 330 bird. So it's a shape about like this. There are other choices, but this is the most common for the occlusal. And when we go through the central groove with this, it does create a convergent walls occlusally, so we get the mechanical retention in the occlusal direction. So we're going to start by cutting through the central groove. This is where I erased a bunch of stuff that I drew, so hopefully you got pictures. So I'm going to start by cutting through the central groove. I'll start somewhere around in here, because I know I'm not close to either the facial lingual margins of what I anticipate the box is going to look like. And over here it's the same thing. I'll start somewhere around in here. Again, I want to make sure I start in a place that I know I'm not already overextending facial lingually. Then in this case, I'll just follow the central groove right through here. In this case, I'll probably come down here a little bit, and then follow along that way. And I'm not going to get too close to the marginal ridge yet. We'll talk about what it takes to control what we're doing when we get close to the marginal ridge. But first, let's just talk about how to cut through the central groove. When I'm cutting through the central groove, of course, why am I doing that? Because there's decay in the central groove. I need to remove the decay, so I need to remove the central groove. What if I did the isthmus here, and the central groove was actually still there? That would be bizarre, wouldn't it? And every once in a while, I'll see that. I'll see a prep, and I'll look at the central groove, or the isthmus, say, nice isthmus, but See this little line right here? That's the central groove. So again, if you made an isthmus and haven't removed the central groove, you haven't done anything. You haven't removed the decay. That's the whole problem. So of course you want to make sure that you've got the isthmus positioned exactly where the central groove is, right? How do we do that? How do we make sure we know that we're cutting through the central groove while we're doing it? So in general, every prep that we do, we're going to do a lot of different kinds of preps. Every step of every prep, there's something that you have to see. You have to know what it is.
The punch card?
Yeah, hold on a second. Let's go to what we have to see. As we are doing the isthmus, what do we have to see? I already gave you one. Huh?
That we are centralized.
Yeah, we have to see that we have the isthmus in the right position facial-lingually, so that we're exactly on top of the central groove. We also need to see if we're leaning the burr facially or lingually. We need to make sure it's basically vertical, parallel to the axis, and following the central groove. That's what we must see. There's no question about it. We have to see that. So what's my next question? You guys are going to learn to know me a little bit better as we go along, and you'll know what I always ask. You'll see it coming a mile away. So we have to see exactly where we are facial-lingually. We have to see the angulation of the burr facial-lingually. So how do we see that? We have to look in the right direction. That's always the way it is. We have to be looking in the right direction. And my next question will always be,
How to find the right direction?
what's the right direction? So in this case, what direction should I look so that I know that I'm cutting through the central groove while I'm doing it? I know I'm doing it right while I'm doing it. I know I don't have the burr leaning facial-lingually while I'm doing it. I can see where I am. I can see the angulation that I am. So what direction do I look so I can see those things? Or is there a direction that I can look where I can see both of those things? So again, you want to see this, you want to see this. What if I'm looking this way? Here's the central groove, here's the isthmus. If I'm looking along the central groove, I can see this, I can see that. Right? Right?
It's confusing.
Yeah. That's mechanical. So you want to see this position, you want to see this angle. The way you're looking at this burr, you can see both of those things, right?
Right.
And that's because you're looking along the central groove. Okay? What if the central groove is running this way? And you're looking perpendicular to the central groove. Well, you can't see the position facial-lingually, and you can't see the angulation facial-lingually, so why would you do it that way? Okay? What about looking down the axis? Maybe I should look down the axis. Okay? A lot of people try that. And if you are one of those people and try it, please only try it one time. Because it'll be a disaster every time. You'd only like it to be a disaster one time. Then try something else. You cannot look down the axis and do a class 2. Because look, all I see is the back of the handpiece, right? And then people get clever. They say, wait a minute, but all I have to do is move the burr. Ah, now I can see the burr. If you really want to see down the axis, the only way to see what you're doing at all is to lean the burr this way, and of course you're killing the adjacent tooth. Okay, so you need to develop a very profound sense of what you need to see, and then what direction to look so that you can actually see that. Does that make sense? It should make more sense than anything you've ever heard. It's the ultimate sense. Okay? There's another one I was just recording yesterday on the Udemy as far as how to see program, saying if you want to cut a certain direction and you're looking in that direction and you're cutting away from your eye or toward your eye, then you're cutting in the right direction. Okay, I repeat that. If you're looking in the right direction and you're cutting away from your eye or toward your eye, then you're cutting in the right direction. That makes sense? Okay, and yet a lot of times people just don't get it. They're trying to cut a straight line this way, instead of looking this way, they look this way and they get all this big curve stuff and get all kinds of things going wrong. So again, we have to be very, very rational when it comes to actually how we do the prep. Okay, so I'm looking along the central groove like this. So here's my eyeball right here. This is an eye. In case you weren't sure, that's an eye. That's an eyebrow. Looking along the central groove, so I can see the position this way, I can see the angulation this way, I know I'm exactly where I should be as I cut through there. Now, what happens when I get close to this mesial pit? I want to stop at a certain point beyond the pit, but not too close to the top of the marginal ridge, right? So what do? How do I see how close I am to the pit? How close I am to the top of the marginal ridge? How do I see the angulation of the burr this way? Look in the right direction. And what's the right direction?
Now
Hmm?
it's occlusally. Now you need to see occlusally.
You can never look down the axis and do a class 2 prep. Never. For no part of it at all. We'll look down the axis when doing occlusal reduction on crown preps. That's a whole different thing because we don't want the burr vertical. But when we want to keep the burr vertical, we can't look down the axis. Okay? Okay. If we want to see where we are, how close we are to the marginal ridge, and we want to see how close we are to the pit, we could look this direction. So here's another eyeball down here. So I'm looking parallel to the marginal ridge, so I can see exactly where I am relative to the pit, exactly where I am relative to the top of the marginal ridge. I can see this angle. I can see that I'm moving the burr back and forth parallel to the marginal ridge, and I can measure the height of the wall. This burr happens to have a height of 1.6. The cutting end is 1.6, so I can see if the burr is slightly taller than the wall, then the height of that wall is about 1.6. So look how much stuff you can see if you're looking in the right direction. Okay, so I can see where I am between the pit and the top of the marginal ridge, 1/3 of the distance between the pit and the top of the marginal ridge. I can see the angulation of the burr. I can see I'm cutting nice and straight, and I can see the wall height compared to the burr, and I know I'm 1.5. So I've got the pulpal floor position I want. I've got the dovetail done the way I want. Then I can come back through the isthmus at that same pulpal level, all the way back through the isthmus, and straight over into the middle of the contact. Now, this is the key point. Once you've done the isthmus and you want to get into close to the adjacent tooth, go right to the center of the contact, facial-lingually, right to the center of the contact, and go as close as you can to the adjacent tooth. It's really an advantage to go right up against the adjacent tooth. 0 millimeters away from the adjacent tooth. Now, of course, as I'm cutting toward the adjacent tooth, I don't want to keep pushing toward the adjacent tooth. At some point, I'll start to just nip with the end of the burr a little bit. Again, the only way you slip, the only time you slip is when is in the direction that you're pushing. So if you're pushing gingerly and you slip, it's okay. We're going to go gingerly anyway. If you're pushing toward the adjacent tooth and you slip, it's going to cut into the adjacent tooth. That's not so good. So end of the burr like this. Now, how do I cut that close to the adjacent tooth without damaging the adjacent tooth? How should I do that?
Right, with the chisel.
No, that's the old textbooks. I want to get right up against the adjacent tooth. I want to put the burr right up against the adjacent tooth. So how should I cut that close to the adjacent tooth and know that I'm not hitting the adjacent tooth?
Angle should be correct.
Look in the right direction. What's the direction? Does that sound familiar? Is it starting to sound familiar now? It's sort of like I'm singing a song and that's the refrain. Okay, so which way should I look so I can know exactly how close the burr is to the adjacent tooth? Buccolingually. Look parallel to the contact. So here's another eye. So in fact, I'm going to look parallel to the contact, downward at a 45-degree angle. I can't look vertically downward. I don't want to look horizontally, so about a 45-degree angle downward and parallel to the contact. I'm going to nip like this right up against the adjacent tooth. Nip, 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 until I get right up against the adjacent tooth. And I'm totally in control. I see exactly where I am. I don't want to be leaving a lot of tooth structure over here because it makes the prep way more complicated. It was what was recommended 50, 60 years ago for doing class 2 preps, but as long as we know how to see how close we are to the adjacent tooth, then we're in good shape. But that means looking in the right direction. And it also means that, and tomorrow we'll talk about loops. And so if you wear suitable magnification, it certainly makes it a lot easier too. You can see the difference between being 0.1 from the adjacent tooth and 0.05 from the adjacent tooth. You can see exactly where you are. There's no question about it at all. That's what we're aiming for, but we'll talk about loops tomorrow. Does anybody, by the way, bring loops with them? Okay, and have you ever worn them before?
Oh, yes.
Do you wear them routinely?
When I practice at home, I always try to wear them. I had a hard time adjusting them in the start, but I finally got the right magnification and everything.
Okay,
Yeah.
the most important thing is the working distance.
Yes, the working distance.
And how far away are you, do you know?
I mean, if I go close, then it's all blurred. If I go too far,
They all have a set distance. but
No,
you-
I don't know the exact set distance.
Yeah, and there's some distances that are better than others.
Okay.
So if you're too far away, I'm going to say, okay, borrow some of ours and see what it's really like to have better loops.
Okay.
But it depends on the distance that they gave you. Where did you get them?
I bought them online. They're not like
Like Amazon or eBay?
Amazon. Yes, they're not like super expensive ones.
Yeah, no, we'll try some of ours.
Okay, for sure.
I've got surgical loops, so.
Surgitel unfortunately has a history of being long focusing.
Long, yeah.
That's the problem. They were made originally for medical surgeries where they need long focusing. Then they wanted to get into the dental field. They kept the working lengths long, and a lot of sales reps in different companies try to get you working long to keep your back straight. We'll talk about that more tomorrow.
But then I feel that when,
Exactly. It's going to be a neck problem.
yeah.
You can't bend your neck down. We have more trouble on the neck than we do on the back.
Yeah,
The sales reps tell you, well, you can sit up with your back straight. Yeah, but I'm bending my neck. It's killing me.
that's true.
And the reason they want you to buy long focusing loops is because if you want to see something when you're that far away, you have to get more magnification. And once you get above about 3.5, then you have to spend about an extra $1,000 for the loops. It's a different style, optically. And of course, then they get higher commissions. So, I've never quite been able to, I've had some loop manufacturers, some reps, that I've been able to educate. I had one guy from orthoscopy that sold over 1,500 sets of loops to my patients, to my students. But, they were 10 to 12 inches. Okay, that's optimal. So anyway, we'll talk about that more tomorrow. But you've been wearing those for a long time. We'll see what the working distance is. You might want to switch tomorrow. And I'd advise you to just leave them alone for today.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, it'll be a different thing. Anyway, you've got to see a lot of detail to work that close to the adjacent tooth, but that's the level of detail that we're expected to see. Okay, so now we're in the middle of the contact. Now we're going to find the facial lingual margins. So we've got to find these margins out here. The order in which I described the prep, remember I found the margins, then I made the angle coming inward, I got the length, made the curve. We're going to do the same thing when we do the prep. I'm going to take my burr and I'm going to look this way parallel to the contact, downward at a 45-degree angle, nip, 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 until I get right out here. And now I find the margin. I probably won't get the burr all the way to the margin because I've got the burr as close as I can to the adjacent tooth, and the clearance means it won't quite get to the margin. So there'll be a little hook left there, but that's okay. But I know that when I trim off that hook, I'll have a good clearance. So I'm going to do the same thing over here on this side. and extend lingually, nip, 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 nip. Now, when I do that, of course, in the upper arch, I'm using the mirror. I'm gonna nip, nip, nip out facially a little bit, and then I have to check to see how I've done, if I've gone far enough facially. Nip a little bit more, check to see how far I've gone. Nip a little bit more, just see how far I've gone. If I've gone far enough, then I can stop. I can go back, check, and nip out lingually, try to find the lingual margin by trial and error. You do a little bit, you check it. You do a little more, you check it. Trial and error. You can't see how close you are to the adjacent tooth and at the same time see how far you've gone facially. Okay? So sometimes we can't see two things at once. Sometimes we can, sometimes we can't. In this case, it's trial and error. So do a little bit, knowing that you're not hitting the adjacent tooth, knowing that your burrs are really close to the adjacent tooth. That's what you have to see. And then you do a trial and error until you get the margin where you want. And then when you cut inward, cut straight in. And then look at it in the mirror and go, okay, that's not 90 degrees. So then you change it. You put the burr back here again and cut straight in again. Then you look in the mirror, oh, still not quite 90 degrees. You cut in again. Now I got the 90 degrees. And then you ask yourself, okay, have I cut in far enough from that margin inward so I'm beyond where I want to put the axial? If yes, then we're going to make a smooth curve here and get rid of all this excess. Same thing over here, adjust the angle until you get to 90 degrees. Again, trial and error to find the margin, trial and error to find the angle, get the length, get the curve, get rid of the excess. So now we have an outline form. That's the occlusal outline form that looks exactly like what we want as we finish the prep. When you do this occlusal outline form well, with good clearances, good angles, long walls, flat walls, knowing that you're beyond where the axial is going to be, then you can go gingerly. And we have a very set approach to going gingerly with safety. But the most important thing about the approach is, number one, to make sure the occlusal outline is done well before you try to go gingerly. Okay? Oh! Look what somebody got me. New pens. It's like Christmas all over again. That green one was just looking a little bit faint. It's not that much better. It's kind of a light green. Okay, so anyway, we found the margin, we found the angle, we got the length, made the curve, all with a 330 burr. Okay, so now to go gingerly, I'm going to use a different burr. I prefer to use a straight Fisher burr. This one's a 55 burr. There are various other straight Fisher burrs that you could use. You can also use burrs that have a rounded end. But it's a distinct advantage to have a flat-ended burr, and I'll tell you about why that is as we go along. We always use a new burr for every prep. Okay, we want the burr to be nice and sharp so it cuts well. I'm going to take this burr, I'm going to switch to a different color to emphasize the different parts of the prep. I'm going to take this burr and I'm going to put it right against the facial wall here. I'm going to drill a hole, and then I'm going to cut away from that wall, 90 degrees away from that wall. I'm going to drill a hole here at the lingual wall at about where I want the axial wall to be, and then I'm going to cut straight away from this wall at a 90-degree angle. When they come together, then I get automatically the curvature I want. Remember, if we have 90-degree exit angles, then I cut 90 degrees away from the lingual wall, my axial wall is always going to have the right shape. So that's the first four steps of going gingerly. Drill a hole at one wall, cut away from that wall. Drill a hole at this wall, cut away from that wall. 1, 2, 3, 4. Huh?
Could you repeat this step again?
1, 2, 3, 4.
Helpful.
Okay, I'll explain it a little bit more clearly over here too. So this is what I'm trying to do. So I'm going to put the burr against this wall. I'm going to drill a hole at some arbitrary depth to start with. and I'm going to cut away from that wall and start this slot coming this direction. I'll drill a hole over here, cut away from this wall, and make a slot going that direction. What I've done at this point is I've done something like this. So I've cut and I've cut away, so now I have a slot that's defined my axial wall, but there's a lot of excess between there and the adjacent tooth. Okay, you see that slot? Can you picture that?
Yeah.
What if we already go deeper?
Ah, well then you went too deep. You can always go farther, you can't go less. So you can look from the side, from the facial lingual, and get an idea as to how deep you're going to have to go, and then, you know, just work your way up on it, a little bit at a time. But of course, at this point, I still have a lot of excess. I have all this excess here, right? I have to get rid of that. So steps 5, 6, and 7 are getting rid of the excess. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Now I'm going to get rid of the excess on the facial side. Get rid of the excess on the lingual side. Now I only have excess in the middle. So I get rid of the excess in the middle with my burr like this, and probably end up with no clearance because I have no clearance. Once I get rid of this excess here, I still don't have any clearance. So what do? I take my 55 burr and go back in, I drill a hole, cut away from this side, drill another hole over here, cut away from that side. So now I've gone, let's say I've gone down to here. So again, repeat the same 7 steps. Drill a hole, cut this way, drill a hole, cut this way. Again, get rid of the excess facially, the excess lingual, the excess in between. And if I went down this far and get rid of the excess, then I have my clearance. Okay, so as we go gingerly, we, number one, make sure we have a nice occlusal outline so that we know that we've actually done the occlusal half of the box already. The occlusal outline already is the top half of the box. So when we go gingerly, we use the occlusal outline to guide the burr as we go gingerly. That's all we have to do. Now, when we do that, make sure we keep the burr vertical. So again, when working in the box, we look parallel to the contact, downward at a 45-degree angle, but we have to make sure the burr is vertical facial lingually. So how are we going to do that? How are we going to make sure the burr is not leaning out facially like this or lingually like that?
Look in the right direction.
Okay, and what direction do you think that should be?
We're gonna look from the lingual side.
Yeah, well, mesially or distally. We should be looking this way so we can see this angle, right?
Okay.
But of course, if we're looking parallel to contact downward at a 45-degree angle, we want to check this angle. How do I check that angle? How do I look this way when I'm looking this way? How do I look from the distal, for example, if I'm looking parallel to the contact downward at a 45-degree angle? How do I check this angle? How do I look from this side? We have these really cool things.
Yeah.
Yeah. These little round silver things. Quite an invention. These are not called cheek retractors, although they're equally good at cheek retraction, but it's actually called a mirror. Okay. So yeah, we can check in another direction. We can look this way when you're doing it, but check this way first to make sure. You can even maybe poke your head around the corner a little bit and see that we have the right vertical angle. Then we can do those 7 steps looking in the right direction, and we can get close to the adjacent tooth. We also want to control the axial wall position, so I have to see where I am axially. If I'm looking parallel to contact downward at a 45-degree angle, I see where I am axially. I see how close I'm to the adjacent tooth. Those are the things that we have to see when we're in the box. You won't necessarily be able to see the whole burr. There's one wall that you can't see the wall. You've done the top half of it already. You can't see the whole burr, but you can see where it is, right? You can see the difference between being right next to the adjacent tooth and being here and then being way too deep axially. Okay, so we're gonna have to develop a sense of that as we're doing it, but we wanna make sure we're not leaning the very facial inward. If you've done a nice job on the occlusal outline, from here up, and then you're going gingerly and you lean the burr facially like this, you're gonna ruin the occlusal outline. You're gonna make this big curved area out there and undermine a lot of enamel. So most of you have had that experience before. And we'll try not to have that experience again. Again, the vertical angle really important. Now we want the facial angle walls to be slightly convergent. By the time you use the burr, and if you're trying to keep it vertical, it's going to get a little convergence anyway. And if you use the hand instruments, which you will be doing, you get a little convergence anyway. So we don't typically have to worry about facial angle convergence. We'll get enough to do just fine. Okay, so the only other thing we need to talk about is how to finish the prep. Right now, we have a hook of unsupported enamel on the lingual margin and on the facial margin, and we have a horizontal gingival floor. And we have no retentive grooves. And we have rounded internal line angles here, the shape of the burr. They're 90 degrees, but they're rounded because of the shape of the burr. So in order to finish this prep, I need to use hand instruments. So we're designed to take care of all this. So I have a hand instrument that the cross section looks like this. I can take that and run it down that facial margin and trim off that hook and run it into the corner and sharpen that internal line angle really well right there. And the other end of the instrument, I can flip it over and do this side of the box over here, get rid of the hook, and sharpen the internal line angle. There's another instrument that has the same cross-sectional shape, but it's oriented differently on the handle, so it fits against the axial wall, and we can also use that for sharpening the internal line angles. We can also use it for placing retentive grooves, and I'll show you how that's done. We're going to come down here to make those retentive grooves like that. We also have a gingival margin trimmer that's designed to angle the gingival floor so there's no unsupported enamel. Now, using the hand instruments will be very difficult to learn how to do. This is going to sound like another one of those really obvious statements. It's really difficult to learn how to use the hand instruments if in fact you never use them. Is that obvious? Right? How are you going to learn how to do something if you never do it? So here's my warning about doing the homework. So I'll assign you a homework prep tonight. It'll be different for each person, but it'll either be 5DO or 12DO, amalgam press. So whatever homework I give you, if it's 5DO, you're going to do a 5DO, you're going to evaluate it, you're going to fix what you can, you're going to see what you couldn't fix, you're going to take it out and the adjacent tooth out, you're going to replace them both, you're going to put it back in, you're going to start another prep, and you're going to do it differently to try to avoid the mistakes you made the last time. Okay, so you'll be tempted. As you're doing a prep, you'll be tempted to stop halfway through and go, oh man, I don't like the way this is going. Then you take it out, put another one in, start over. I'm saying that's the last thing in the world you should do, but you'll be tempted to do it. Next time you get 60% of the way through, or 70% of the way through. Then the next time after that, you get 75% of the way through. The next time after you get 80% of the way through. So you've done 5 preps, and you've not finished 1. Okay? Finish every prep you start. You'll learn a lot just by the very act of finishing. You might get to the point where you say, okay, I'm 3/4 of the way through, I can't go any farther, I'm stuck. Well, the last thing in the world you want to do is take it out and start again. What you want to do is go back a few steps and redo what you just finished so that now it's easy to see how you can do the next step. Okay? It's doing every step partially that gets you in trouble. If I do each step halfway, if I do this step halfway and this step halfway and this step halfway, pretty soon I got nothing. You know, I'm stuck. I can't go any further. So you can steps and get to the point where, okay, now I can go farther ahead. Then you can finish the prep. You can learn how to use the hand instruments because you actually use them. Then it'll be in good shape. All right? But really resist the temptation to start over. You can't do it on a patient, and you shouldn't be doing it on a typodont. It's a bad habit to get into. So, as you do the homework, again, as I've gone through, you do the prep, you look at it, fix what you can do it differently the next time, try to change something so that you can avoid some mistakes that you made before. And then if you need to, if you get stuck, go back and redo some previous steps in the same prep, and then you can go farther ahead, and you might need to redo a couple other things, and then you can go farther ahead. Finish it up that way with the hand instruments, and then we're looking good. Then you're going to learn as fast as possible. Okay, so I'll show you how all this is done, but you should have a pretty good sense as to what it is we need to look for to see that the Class 2 amalgam prep is done well enough to last a long time. We should understand why we do it the way that we do it, how it's designed, in order to take into consideration the characteristics of the tooth structures, dentin and enamel, mostly enamel in this case, and the material that we're restoring it with, in this case amalgam. And then we're going to be, again, learning the techniques of doing it. We've described it here, that's not enough. I need to show you the techniques, and that's what we're going to be working on. But again, we've got to make sure that you're looking in the right direction. That's the number one thing. Okay, figure out what it is you need to see, make sure you can. Does that sound simple? Ask yourself, what do I need to see? And then make sure you can see it. That's as rational as you can possibly be. Okay? But some of you will not, and my typical student, is working through a prep, and they're not really paying attention to what they need to see, and then they get in all kinds of trouble because they're looking the wrong way. Hollywood has made billions of dollars on people looking the wrong way. And you might even imagine that. How many of you like horror films? Nobody likes horror films?
I mean, they're fine. I used to watch them when I was
Okay.
young.
Yeah. Looking for a thrill? Yeah. I would think that, I used to think that, guys really like horror films, all this kind of stuff, but, sometimes I have more women that like them than men. I don't know why. Anyway, I'm not particularly a fan, but I've seen enough of them to know that there's always the same scene in every movie.
Jump scares.
There's a pretty girl and a door.
She got old.
On the other side of the door is a dark room.
Yeah.
And the monster's in the room. And the monster's over there, and she's looking here. Right? She's walking in the room looking this way, and everybody knows the monster's there, so everybody in the audience is saying, hey, look over there, so she can hear him. Right? That's what gets everybody excited and so forth. But, that kind of, idiocy sells big time in Hollywood. Okay? But that's not what we're doing here. Okay? For example, here's the burr, here's the adjacent tooth. Which way do we have to look to see how close the burr is to the adjacent tooth? We have to see how close the burr is to the adjacent tooth. We have to see the space between the burr and the adjacent tooth. If we can't see that space, we're hitting the adjacent tooth. Okay? At the same time, how do you check to make sure the burr is vertical this way? We have to look from the side. Okay? In general, if you want to see if anything's vertical, you have to look in two directions. Right? And if you're looking one way, you see this, but you can't see this. You have to check in two directions to see if anything's vertical. Remember that, because I asked you that question again in the workbook. And you wouldn't believe that practically nobody gets the answer right. I ask, if you want to see if a burr is vertical, what do you have to do? The answer is look in two directions. And everybody says something completely meaningless in that respect. If you want to see if anything's vertical, you have to look this way and you have to check in the other direction. See this angle one way, this angle the other way. And even we're going to be doing preps that require that we control very carefully the angulation of the burr in two planes. You've got to deliberately and rationally figure out how to do that, and then you're going to be totally in control. So that's what we're working for as we go along. Okay.
Do we have these dimensions in these pamphlets? that we gave them?
Have the what?
The dimensions, the distances, the everything. Everything.
You have something with which you can measure those dimensions?
No, how much should be the distance from, like, I mean, the measurements that you already explained now, are they?
You have them. Yeah, they're right here.
Oh, what about here?
Oh, that's why we have a pen or a phone. Okay? Yeah, so that's why I say, you can take some pictures and so forth. But we'll be doing it so many times it'll become obvious. But yeah, you're free to take notes and do drawings and so forth. And unfortunately, remind me of this tomorrow, because I forgot to give you out a sheet of paper that has these drawings on it, so you could take notes on it. Makes it easier to take notes. But anyway, yeah, most of these dimensions are all written out here and so forth, but it's best for you to write it up in a way that makes sense to you. Okay? But again, watch the Udemy video. That's going to have a lot of stuff on there too. Okay?
Doctor, you don't use 245 in class?
I tend not to. Sometimes that's the only burr that you have. If you take an exam at some school, they won't let you use your own burrs. They might have a 245 that they want you to use. The problem with that is it's a rounded end. It's very round. And so it leaves a lip at the gingival margin. You can't get rid of that lip. The flat-ended burr, you can get that gingival floor flat all the way to the margin. 245 always leaves this lip. If you were to cut it away with a hand instrument, it'll probably break. That's a problem. So what I suggest you do is the 330 burr, which everybody basically has. The end is a little flatter. So if you don't have a 55 burr, use the 330 burr in the box to get rid of that lip as much as you can. And then be really gentle with your GMT, and you might not break that gingival margin.
So I've used burr 556.
Yeah.
It's the same burr. No.
It's a crosscut burr,
Crosscut.
and it's 1/10 of a millimeter wider. So this is 0.8, that's 0.9.
0.9. Okay.
Yeah, so it's
And is it a flat end as well?
yes, it is.
Okay.
It's a straight fissure burr, but it's the 5 part of 556 is because of the crosscuts.
Crosscut. That can be a problem.
Huh? And that doesn't make any difference one way or the other with the crosscuts. But it is a little bit bigger, so the 55 burr cuts a smoother wall,
That's right.
and it's a little bit smaller, so it's easier to control. And you get a more defined internal line angle, so that the hand instrument doesn't have as much work to do.
Yes, sir. And sir, sorry, one last question.
I'm not sure I believe that, but go ahead.
Yes, for the moment.
I want lots of questions,
Yes.
so.
For the minute, one last question.
For the minute, yeah.
So we have to make a bevel as well. So when we make the gingival box, so we have to make a bevel on the axial wall as well.
The axial line angle.
Axial wall line.
Right there, yep. How do you want to do that?
I always use it I do it with a hand instrument, but it always comes it always comes a different bevel.
The GMT works fine.
GMT.
Yeah, I'll probably demonstrate that a little bit later, but if you have a 55 burr,
Yes, sir.
you can use the end of the burr and bevel that very easily too. So there's all kinds of different ways. Yeah.
I would
So-
use the hand instrument, not the bar right now.
Well, it's up to you. As long as you know what it is you're trying to accomplish, at this point I'm happy.
Yes, sir.
Okay? And then, experiment around, try different things. I don't want you just doing everything exactly the way I'm telling you to do it because I'm telling you to do it that way. I want you to try different things, see what works. But if you try something and it doesn't work, I want you to know that it doesn't work and try something different next time.
Yes, sir.
When you try something and it doesn't work, if you don't know that it doesn't work, you got a problem. If you know it doesn't work, but you try it again the same way and it doesn't work again, and you try it again the same way and it doesn't work again,
Okay.
you're doing doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result.
Yes, sir.
And that's the definition of neurosis, right?
Exactly.
So you don't want to be neurotic about this.
Yes.
Any other questions? Okay, cool. So what we're going to do is at a quarter of. So that's 13 minutes. Synchronized watches. At a quarter of, I'm going to do the demonstration. And I'll do an upper premolar, and then here's what I want you to do. You'll start on an upper premolar on the right side, and it'll be either a first or second premolar. Do not do a box near the canine. That's too small and too shifted facially for you right now. So I'll keep it a little bit simpler right now. So definitely, you have three possibilities. You must have a proximal contact that's physically touching, and you must look at the teeth first and make sure there's no damage on either tooth. Okay? And then you can do the MO or the DO on the second premolar or the DO on the first premolar. Okay, so the first one, I'm going to have you do the occlusal outline and then stop. Do not go gingerly. Okay? Stop at the occlusal outline. I will help you with the occlusal outline, make sure it's as good as we can get it, and then I'll get you started going gingerly. The second one on the upper left, again, any of those three preps, good proximal contact, has to be. And then I might have you do the whole thing, and I'll help you with that. But you're going to learn then that if you do the occlusal outline poorly, when you go gingerly, it's a disaster. So we're going to try to learn, if anything today, learn that it requires a nice occlusal outline in order to go gingerly with any kind of control. And hopefully you'll also learn today that if you get stuck and can't do something, go back a few steps, change some things, and then set yourself up to going ahead farther. You'll see me do this all the time. I don't know if I've ever sat down to help somebody where I haven't gone back and redone the last 4 or 5 steps. Okay, that's what I typically do, so that I can go ahead. If a student's stuck, I can't go ahead either. Okay? The prep has not been done to the point where we can advance. It cannot be done. Nobody can do it. Okay, and the difference between you and me is that you'll just stay there stuck, and I'll go back and I'll change some things, and then all of a sudden it's easy. So that's what we're going to try to learn as we go. Okay, quarter of demonstration right here. It'll be on your screens, and I'll see you then. Yes, sir.